I still remember the sound of the old amusement park that afternoon, the distant ring of the carousel bell, the uneven rhythm of a popcorn machine, the warm hum of families drifting from ride to ride. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. My wife had taken our son to buy a snack, leaving me alone on a bench, enjoying a few quiet minutes. And yet, in that short silence, I felt something shift, like a thread pulling tight in the air. When I glanced up, I saw a man staring at me from across the walkway. He looked as if he had just stepped out of a memory he wasn't ready to face. He approached slowly, hesitant, almost fearful, with a kind of exhaustion that belonged to someone much older than he appeared to be. His clothes were ordinary, but worn in a way that suggested long days, long roads, and an even longer burden. He stopped a few feet from me, eyes trembling, as if fighting the urge to turn back, and then he spoke my son's name, softly, carefully, with the familiarity of someone who had spoken it many times before. At first I thought he was mistaken, or unstable, or maybe just someone who noticed my family earlier and wanted to make polite conversation. But then he mentioned details, small, private things about my son he should have never known. The way my boy avoided onions on his hot dog, the drawing he made the night before of a rocket ship, a scratch on his knee from a fall he'd taken that same morning. Each detail landed like a cold hand on my chest. Each one made the world around me feel thinner, more fragile. The man's voice broke when he finally told me why he'd come. He said he wasn't from here, not from now. He said he had known my son as an adult, had worked with him, competed with him, fought for the same opportunities. And in that distant future, he had done something he carried like a wound. He had undercut my son to get ahead. That decision had ruined more than one life. It had hollowed him out. Then he begged me for forgiveness he said he didn't deserve. His hands shook. His eyes shined with a kind of regret I'd never seen in anyone. And before I could ask who he truly was, or how any of this was possible, or what future he had stolen from my son, he stepped back, swallowed hard, and whispered that he couldn't stay. The next moment, he disappeared into the crowd, gone as quietly as he arrived, leaving me with a truth I still don't know how to live with. I didn't follow Jeff right away. For a moment, I just sat there on the bench, staring at the space where he'd been standing seconds earlier. The sound of the amusement park carried on around me as if nothing had happened. Children laughing, the soft clatter of rides in motion, a radio playing an old tune somewhere behind the food stalls. But none of it felt real, not after what he'd told me. When my wife and Lucas returned with their snacks, I tried to smile, tried to settle back into the easy warmth of the afternoon. Lucas talked excitedly about the games he wanted to try next, waving his hands the way he always did when he was happy. I kept nodding, answering him, doing everything I could to sound normal. But inside, I felt my thoughts creeping back to Jeff, to his trembling voice, to the way he seemed afraid of himself. I kept wondering whether I should have asked more, if I should have grabbed his arm before he slipped away and demanded the truth from him. Was he really from a future where he had worked with my son? Was he truly carrying that much guilt? Or had I just spoken to a man who needed help I didn't know how to give? Each possibility unsettled me in a different way. Still, there was something about him, his eyes, the way he said my son's name, that wouldn't let me dismiss the encounter as a random incident. I'd seen people lie before. I'd seen people exaggerate or seek attention. But Jeff wasn't doing any of that. He wasn't proud of the future he'd come from. He wasn't trying to frighten me. He looked like a man who had run out of places to hide, and that loneliness stayed with me long after we left the park. The rest of the evening I found myself watching Lucas more closely, wondering how much of the future was already taking shape without us noticing. Hi, my name is Greg. If you're enjoying this story, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had a moment that made you question whether the future can change? Thank you for listening and for supporting these quiet stories. Now let's get back to the story. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up before the dreams could form, sitting in the dark with the echo of Jeff's voice still drifting around in my head. My wife Karen slept beside me, breathing evenly, undisturbed. Lucas was down the hall, curled in his blankets, safe, unaware of the weight that had settled on me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jeff standing under the fading lights of the amusement park, his shoulders drawn inward, his hands shaking, his eyes filled with regret he couldn't seem to carry anymore. By morning, I knew I couldn't pretend everything was normal. Not to myself. Not after what he told me. I got up early, hoping a routine might steady me. Coffee, shower, bread to toast, the usual order of small tasks that made up an average morning. But every movement felt slightly off, like I was performing my own life from a few inches outside of it. When I reached for the coffee tin, my hand paused mid-air. I thought of Jeff's expression when he said Lucas's name. Too intimate to be coincidental. Too careful to be harmless. Karen noticed. She always did. "You're quiet today," she said, reaching for 2 plates. "Didn't sleep well," I answered. It was true, but incomplete. She gave me a look that said she wanted to ask more but decided not to push. We'd been married long enough for her to recognize when my silence had layers, and longer still to know I'd speak when I was ready. I wasn't. Not yet. Lucas came down the stairs rubbing his eyes, his hair in every direction. He smiled as soon as he saw me, the kind of smile that pressed against the chest, reminding me of everything that mattered. "Dad," he said, "can we go to the park again today?" His voice hit me harder than I expected. I thought of Jeff's trembling apology, of the future he claimed to have shared with the grown version of my son, a future where he'd undercut Lucas, my Lucas, to get ahead. I forced a smile. "We'll see, buddy." We went through the morning motions, getting dressed, packing lunches, discussing small tasks for the day. But to me, everything carried an undertone of surveillance. I kept watching Lucas, the way he pushed his cereal around before eating it, the way he hummed quietly to himself, the scratch on his knee from the fall he'd taken at the park. I found myself studying details I usually overlooked, as if the future Jeff spoke of might leave clues in the present. But it didn't. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing felt out of place. Everything was painfully, comfortingly ordinary. After dropping Lucas off at school, I sat in the car for a long moment. Part of me expected Jeff to appear again, stepping out from behind a tree or walking up to the car window. He didn't. The only movement came from parents rushing back to their routines, teachers guiding children toward the building, and a cold wind pressing against the windshield. I drove to work, but my mind stayed stuck between that bench at the amusement park and the fragments of a future I couldn't confirm. My job, managing inventory for a local warehouse, normally kept me grounded. It was simple, systematic, predictable. But that morning, none of the usual certainty was there. Every number looked unfamiliar. Every task felt slightly wrong. It was as if Jeff had introduced a crack into my understanding of what tomorrow meant, and I couldn't stop staring at it. Around noon, I stepped outside for air. The cold felt good on my face. I tried replaying the encounter in my mind carefully, piece by piece. Jeff's voice, the details he knew, the fear he carried. Was it possible he was telling the truth? I wasn't someone who believed in impossible things. I believed in work, in patterns, in choices that made sense. But Jeff hadn't behaved like a liar. He hadn't looked like a man trying to manipulate me. He looked like someone running from the consequences of a life he had already lived. And the worst part, the part I couldn't push away, was how deeply he believed what he told me. That conviction alone was enough to turn a quiet morning into an unsettled one. And once it started, the rest of the day never found its way back to normal. The rest of that workday passed in slow, uneven stretches, like time had thickened into something heavier. I kept catching myself drifting off mid-task, staring at boxes I'd handled 100 times before, as if they belonged to a world I no longer fully recognized. I tried grounding myself with small routines, counting shipments, writing notes, checking the inventory screen. But every time my mind settled, I felt Jeff's presence creeping back in. The way he looked at me, the regret in his voice, the weight of everything he didn't say. By the time I clocked out, I wasn't any closer to understanding what had happened. If anything, the uncertainty had grown sharper, more insistent. My drive to pick up Lucas felt longer than usual, though the route was familiar. The streets of our neighborhood, the rows of quiet houses, the old maple trees lining the sidewalks, they all looked the same, but they didn't feel the same. I kept imagining those same streets decades from now, trying to picture the version of reality Jeff claimed to come from. When I arrived at school, Lucas ran toward me with the same excitement he always had, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. That small, simple joy hit me harder than I wanted to admit. "Dad, we made rockets today," he said, waving a small cardboard creation in the air. Mine went the highest. I nodded and smiled, but my chest tightened. Rockets. Future. Jeff's voice echoed again. I worked with him, and I undercut him to get ahead. It felt different hearing it now, after a full day of holding that information alone. More real, more threatening. As we walked to the car, Lucas kept talking about his school day, and I kept listening, truly listening, like each word might be something precious I needed to memorize before time could do anything to it. He climbed into the back seat, humming to himself, completely unaware that a stranger had stepped out of his future and broken something inside it. On the drive home, he kept up his stream of stories, his voice softer as the afternoon sun filtered through the windows. Halfway home, I glanced at him through the mirror and asked as casually as I could, "Lucas, do you ever think about what you want to be when you grow up?" He shrugged, looking out the window. "Maybe an inventor," he said, "or someone who builds things." It shouldn't have shaken me as much as it did. It was a harmless thought, the kind of answer any child might give. But the simplicity of it cut deeper than anything else that day. Because behind that small dream was a future I suddenly felt responsible for protecting, even from a timeline I couldn't see. Later at home, while Lucas played in his room, Karen asked me if anything was wrong. She didn't push, but she could feel the distance. "You've been somewhere else today," she said quietly. "I'm just tired," I replied. It was all I could offer without unraveling. She touched my arm, gently, knowingly, then let it go. "Well, if you need to talk, I'm here." I nodded. But talking about Jeff felt impossible. Saying it out loud would make it more real, too real. And I wasn't ready for that. That evening, after Lucas went to bed, I found myself sitting alone in the living room. The house was dark except for the soft glow of a lamp. Outside the windows, the night was quiet, the street empty. I kept replaying Jeff's exact words, trying to analyze every inflection, every pause. "I undercut your son to succeed." Not might undercut, not could undercut, but did. Past tense, a future past. A contradiction that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. I wondered about the version of Lucas Jeff knew, what kind of man he became, what kind of dreams he carried, and how one act of selfish ambition could have changed so much that a grown man would break under its weight. For the first time since meeting Jeff, a new thought surfaced, one I didn't want to entertain but could no longer avoid. What if he wasn't warning me? What if he was asking me to stop something he already couldn't? The question lingered long after midnight, heavy enough to keep sleep at a distance. And for the first time in years, I felt afraid of tomorrow. Not because of what it might bring, but because someone had already lived it. The next morning felt different from the moment I opened my eyes. Not heavier exactly, just unfamiliar. Like waking up in a house that looked like mine, but wasn't quite right. Sunlight came through the curtains in the usual way, but even that felt strange, as if I were noticing it for the first time. I heard Lucas in the hallway, his small feet tapping against the floor as he looked for his socks. I heard Karen in the kitchen, humming the same song she always hummed while making breakfast. Everything was normal. Everything was stable, but I wasn't. I moved through the morning routine like someone following a script. I poured cereal for Lucas, brewed coffee, answered a few of Karen's questions without really hearing them. My mind wasn't in the kitchen. It was still standing on that bench at the amusement park, staring at Jeff as he dissolved into the crowd. I kept waiting for the tension inside me to fade, but instead it seemed to settle deeper, becoming something I carried beneath the surface of every thought. Before work, I drove Lucas to school. He sat in the back seat, swinging his feet and talking about the rocket project again. His excitement felt warm and pure, and for a moment it almost drowned out the fear I'd been carrying. Almost. At a stoplight, he leaned forward and pointed at something outside. "Dad, look! That dog has the same ears as the one we saw yesterday." I nodded, smiling at him through the mirror. But behind that smile was a question I couldn't avoid anymore. How much of his future was already written, and how much of it could still be changed? After dropping him off, I didn't head straight to work. I parked a few blocks from the warehouse and just sat there, letting the engine tick quietly as it cooled. I kept replaying Jeff's apology in my mind, his voice shaking, his eyes glossy with guilt. "I undercut your son," he had said. "I took something that should have been his." That sentence echoed with a strange weight. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a confession from someone who had spent a lifetime wishing they could reverse a moment. Someone who believed that even crossing time wasn't enough to undo what he had done. Eventually, I forced myself out of the car and into work. My co-workers joked through the morning, tossing comments back and forth in the break room. I tried to join in, but my responses came out thin, distant. "You all right, Greg?" someone asked. "Just a long weekend," I answered. It wasn't a lie. Not exactly, but it wasn't the truth either. During lunch, I stepped outside again and stood by the side of the building, watching cars drift along the road. I found myself searching faces without thinking. Men walking alone, drivers at stoplights, strangers stepping out of storefronts. I kept expecting to see Jeff, not because I thought he'd come back, but because some part of me wanted proof that he wasn't just a hallucination stitched together by fear and coincidence. He didn't appear, but the doubt stayed. Later that afternoon, while going through inventory sheets, I noticed something I hadn't caught before. Jeff never mentioned the name of the company where he and the older Lucas had worked. He never said what industry they were in. He never explained how their paths crossed in that future. But he knew Lucas. Not as a child, not as a stranger. He knew him as an adult, well enough to compete with him, fight for opportunities, and regret the outcome. That realization struck me harder than anything else so far. You don't regret betraying a stranger. You regret betraying someone you knew. By the time my shift ended, the light outside had already turned a soft winter orange. I drove home slowly, letting the color settle over the streets. It made everything feel older, like a memory I was living from the outside. When I walked through the front door, Lucas ran toward me with another drawing in his hand. This one of a little house on a hill, with a sun too big for the sky. "Do you like it?" he asked. I nodded, but something in my chest tightened again. "Yes, buddy, I do." Because looking at that drawing, I felt a quiet dread ripple through me, one I hadn't felt the day before. I realized I wasn't just afraid of Jeff's future. I was afraid of the version of Lucas who lived inside it. I woke the next day with a decision forming somewhere deep inside me, even before I was fully conscious of it. I couldn't keep drifting through each hour with Jeff's words echoing in my mind. I needed something. Clarity, proof, contradiction. Anything that might anchor the truth to something solid. The encounter had cracked open a part of me I didn't know existed, and if I didn't face it soon, I felt it would spread through my life like a quiet leak in the foundation of a house. Lucas was cheerful that morning, full of chatter and small stories. He held up another drawing he'd made before bed, a crooked tree beside a river, and explained the colors he chose. I listened, really listened, the way a man does when he suddenly fears how time might twist around someone he loves. Karen poured coffee while humming a soft tune, occasionally glancing at me as if she sensed the distance I still carried. After dropping Lucas at school, I didn't drive to work, not right away. Instead, I headed toward the amusement park, the place where everything had started. It was closed on weekdays this time of year, but I parked outside the rusted gate and sat in the cold morning quiet. The stillness was unsettling. Without families, noise, and color, the place looked abandoned, almost ghost-like. The empty rides and silent walkways felt like a stage waiting for a memory to replay itself. I walked along the fence, gripping the cold metal, trying to recall every detail of Jeff's face. His eyes haunted me the most, not because they were frightening, but because they held a kind of grief that didn't belong to a stranger. If he truly came from Lucas's future, then that meant he had known my son as a man, which meant he had seen a version of my life I couldn't reach, and he regretted it. That thought tightened inside me like a knot I couldn't loosen. I stayed there for nearly an hour, hoping, irrationally, that Jeff might return to the spot where he had found me. He didn't. The world stayed still, and the quiet felt heavier by the minute. Eventually, practicality pulled me back. I couldn't hide by that fence all day. I needed answers somewhere else. So I drove. I didn't have a destination at first. I let instinct move me through the small grid of town streets until I ended up on the road that led to the industrial district, an old stretch of warehouses, repair shops, and struggling businesses. It wasn't beautiful, but it was familiar. It looked like the sort of place where a future businessman might compete for opportunities, where ambition might clash, where betrayal might take shape. I pulled into a small diner where I sometimes grabbed lunch during long shifts. The place was half empty, the air warm and thick with the smell of coffee and fried onions. I ordered something small, more out of habit than hunger. When the waitress left, I found myself staring at the laminated menu without seeing a single word on it. Instead, my mind circled back to Jeff's confession. "I took something your son should have had." Those words carried weight, not just guilt, but knowledge of something specific. A position, a deal, a company, a project. Whatever it was important enough that Jeff believed it shaped Lucas's entire life. People don't cross time for something small. They don't break under the memory of a harmless mistake. A part of me wanted to know the details. Another part feared what knowing might change. Halfway through my coffee, something unexpected happened. A man walked into the diner. A stranger. But for a split second, my heart seized, convinced it was Jeff. The posture, the slow step, the hesitant glance toward the tables. My breath caught in my throat. But when he lifted his head fully, the illusion faded. Different face, different life. Still, the moment rattled me, because it made me realize something I hadn't admitted before. I wasn't just afraid of Jeff's story. I was afraid of seeing him again, because seeing him again would mean the future he described wasn't just possible. It was real. When I finally left the diner, I felt no closer to understanding anything. But there was one small difference from the day before. I no longer felt powerless. Something inside me had shifted. If Jeff wouldn't come back to give me answers, then I would start looking for them myself, and that quiet decision followed me all the way home. I didn't tell Karen where I'd been that morning, and she didn't ask. She had a quiet intuition about people, especially me, and she could sense when something was weighing on my mind. Still, there were limits to what a person could hide. While she made dinner and Lucas built a small castle out of wooden blocks in the living room, I found myself drifting again, staring at nothing, feeling the hours slide off center. Eventually, Karen touched my arm and said, "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone." I wanted to believe that, but I didn't know how to explain any of it. I didn't know whether words like future and regret and he undercut my son would make me sound insane or simply lost. And maybe I was lost. Jeff had dropped something heavy into my life, and I was still trying to figure out how to carry it. After dinner, while Karen cleaned up and Lucas finished brushing his teeth, I stepped outside for air. The night was cold enough to make the porch boards creak under my feet. Breath came out in pale threads, disappearing as quickly as they formed. The street was dark and still, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel important. The distant bark of a dog, the hum of a passing car, the soft rustle of leaves. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just needed to breathe somewhere that didn't feel like it was closing in on me. But the quiet didn't help. It made Jeff's voice louder. I leaned against the porch railing and closed my eyes. He appeared in my thoughts clearly. His slouched posture, the way he held his hands as if afraid to touch anything, the raw sorrow in his expression. He looked like a man who had spent years trying to outrun a version of himself he hated, the kind of regret that doesn't fade, not even with time, especially not with time. The porch light flicked on behind me. Lucas stepped outside in his pajamas, clutching his favorite stuffed bear under one arm. "Dad?" he asked, voice soft. "Are you sad?" It was such a simple question, one I hadn't prepared for. I kneeled down beside him, brushing windblown hair from his forehead. "No, buddy," I said gently. "Just thinking too much." He nodded like he understood more than he should. Kids have a way of sensing the things adults try to hide. "Okay," he whispered, hugging the bear closer. "Good night." I hugged him back, holding him longer than he expected. "Good night, Lucas." Once he went back inside, I stayed on the porch, staring down the street like I half expected Jeff to be standing at the corner. The possibility both terrified me and pulled at me. If he appeared again, maybe I could finally ask the questions that burned inside me. What did you take from him? What future did you break? Why come back now? But the street remained empty. Later that night, after Karen fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table alone with a notebook. I wasn't sure why. I hadn't kept a journal in years. Yet something inside me pushed to write everything down, as if acknowledging the encounter on paper might help me make sense of it. I wrote Jeff's name, or the name he gave me. I wrote everything he had said, everything I remembered about his face and posture and eyes, every detail he knew about Lucas. But the more I wrote, the stranger it felt, because the moment ink touched paper, it no longer felt like the memory of a man's confession. It felt like the first piece of a puzzle I never asked to solve. I closed the notebook, suddenly overwhelmed, and pushed it aside. That's when a thought surfaced, quiet, uninvited, but sharp enough to grab hold of me. What if Jeff's regret wasn't just about what he did to Lucas? What if coming back wasn't only about apologizing? What if he was trying to change something, not for himself, but for us? I didn't know if that made the situation better or worse, but I knew this much. Jeff had opened a door I couldn't close, and whether the future he described was real or imagined, I was already stepping toward it, one hesitant, unavoidable thought at a time. The following day began like any other, but I felt a quiet urgency building inside me, something I couldn't pin down. I moved through the morning with the same sense of displacement I'd been feeling, like every action was slightly misaligned with who I used to be. Karen noticed it again, though she didn't say much. She just watched me with that patient concern she had, a kind of gentle awareness that made her presence feel grounding, even when I couldn't explain why I needed it. Lucas, meanwhile, bounced through the morning with his usual energy, full of ideas and questions. He told me about a story he was writing in school about a man who fixed broken rockets, and the coincidence hit me harder than it should have. I tried to smile, tried to sound encouraging, but the mention of a man from the future, even in a child's imagination, sent a tremor through me I couldn't hide. After dropping him off at school, I sat in the car again, letting the engine idle as the minutes ticked by. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, an answer, a sign, or maybe just the courage to admit that Jeff's visit had shaken the foundations of my life more than I wanted to admit. Eventually I drove to work, though I barely remember the trip. My mind was too busy tracing the edges of Jeff's confession, trying to find something solid in the blur of his words. Once again, I found myself distracted during tasks, pretending to focus while my thoughts pulled me elsewhere. Around midday, while walking between aisles of stacked boxes, a sudden memory hit me, not from Jeff, not from the park, but from years earlier, when Lucas had been a toddler just learning to walk. He had stumbled constantly, leaning on me for support, trusting my hands to guide him. And now, somehow, I was trusting his future to a stranger's remorse. The thought nearly brought me to my knees. I stepped outside to breathe. The air was cold, sharp, clearing some of the fog from my mind. I leaned against the side of the building, staring at the cracked pavement beneath my feet. That's when another thought crept in, one that felt both terrifying and strangely obvious. If Jeff truly came from the future, then all of this, his regret, his warning, his apology, meant he believed something could be changed. Otherwise, why come back at all? The idea wove itself through me like a slow-burning fuse. If Jeff wanted to ease his guilt, he could have lived his life in quiet remorse. But instead, he stepped across time to find a man he had never met in the past, a man whose son he had wronged decades later. That wasn't just guilt. That wasn't just regret. That was intention. It felt strange to think of Jeff having a purpose beyond apology, but the more I considered it, the more it made sense. He didn't give me the details of the event in their future. He didn't explain the nature of the opportunity he stole. He didn't tell me how Lucas reacted or what kind of life he went on to have afterward. He told me just enough to pull me into awareness, enough to make me watch my son more carefully, enough to make me question the path ahead, enough to plant uncertainty in the place where trust in the future used to live. Was he trying to warn me, or was he trying to change something? And if so, what part of the path was I supposed to alter? The questions gnawed at me, each one splintering into more. I tried to bury them under work, under numbers and routines, but they followed me through the afternoon. By the time I clocked out, the sky had shifted into the pale indigo of early evening, the kind of color that made everything look like a memory. On the drive home, I found myself glancing at every pedestrian, every driver, every figure in the distance. Some irrational part of me kept expecting Jeff to appear again, to step out from the edge of the world the same way he had entered it. But he didn't. The road remained quiet, the town unchanged. When I reached home, Lucas ran to meet me at the door, waving a new drawing with excitement. His joy was so pure, so untouched by the shadows that had settled over me, that I felt something inside my chest soften and ache all at once. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty, whatever came next, I couldn't let the future Jeff described become the only future my son ever had. I didn't plan on doing anything unusual the next morning, but something kept pulling me toward places I normally wouldn't go. It felt like my routines were slowly being rewritten, not by force, but by a quiet instinct that had begun forming the moment Jeff spoke my son's name. I kept telling myself I just wanted to understand what had happened, but underneath that desire was something heavier, fear of repeating a future I knew nothing about. After dropping Lucas off at school, I didn't turn toward work. Instead, I turned onto a different road, a long, empty stretch that led toward the outskirts of town. I couldn't explain why. I just needed space, a place where no one knew me, where the noise of daily life couldn't hide the thoughts I kept avoiding. The morning was cool, with a pale sky that hovered between blue and gray. I drove until I reached a small, old park I hadn't visited in years. It wasn't much, just a few benches, a rusted swing set, and a cluster of trees whose branches tangled above like an old canopy. I sat on one of the benches and let the silence settle. Jeff's face appeared in my mind again, clearer than ever. The way he stood when he approached, how his shoulders curved inward as if bracing against a weight no one else could see. I replayed his apology word for word, trying to catch something I missed. I undercut your son, and it ruined both of us. Both of us. That part hadn't hit me as hard the first time, but now it echoed with a new intensity. If he'd ruined his own life too, then his visit wasn't simply about easing guilt. It meant something broke, deeply, and he believed warning me mattered enough to cross time for it. But what was I supposed to do now? A car pulled into the small gravel lot nearby, breaking my thoughts. A man stepped out, older, bundled in a heavy coat. For a moment my breath caught, thinking it might be Jeff, but the man walked toward the trail behind the trees without glancing my way. Still, the moment rattled me. I was slowly becoming someone who watched strangers the way people watch for storms. I leaned back and let out a long breath, trying to ground myself. That was when another realization surfaced, one that had been building quietly inside me, but hadn't taken shape until now. I had no idea what Jeff had taken from Lucas in that future, but that didn't change one truth. My son already lived in a world where people competed, sometimes ruthlessly, and Jeff had been one of them. Someone who stepped over Lucas to succeed, someone who regretted it so much that remorse followed him across decades. But who was to say it would be Jeff? What if someone else in Lucas's future, someone I'd never meet, could do the same? How was I supposed to protect a child from a future I couldn't see? The question pressed on me like a hand against my chest. Maybe Jeff wasn't just confessing. Maybe he was telling me that the world ahead wouldn't always be gentle with my son, that people with more ambition, more power, more hunger, might shape his life in ways I couldn't prevent. But then again, why apologize? Why come back? Why face me at all? There was something unfinished in Jeff's eyes, something desperate, almost pleading, as if he wanted me to understand more than the words he managed to say. Maybe he wanted me to change something he couldn't. The idea lingered uncomfortably. Changing the future was a concept that didn't fit anywhere in my life. I planned days, months, years, but changing fate, that felt like something that belonged in stories, in old myths whispered around campfires, not in the quiet life of a man who spent his days driving his son to school and counting inventory in a warehouse. But here I was, sitting on a cold bench, letting the future feel like a door someone had cracked open just enough for me to sense the darkness behind it. My phone buzzed, startling me. It was Karen, asking if everything was okay. I typed back, yes, just needed some air. It was only half true. I stood, brushed the gravel from my coat, and took one last look at the empty park. The trees swayed slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if the wind carried something more than cold air. I didn't know where I was heading next, but I did know this. Whatever Jeff had started in me, it wasn't finished. I drove away from the old park without any real destination in mind, letting the roads guide me the way drifting thoughts do, loosely, aimlessly, but always toward something unresolved. The town felt smaller than usual, like the edges of it were folding inward. Familiar houses, familiar storefronts, familiar intersections, and yet every piece of it looked different now, carrying the weight of a future I wasn't prepared to face. At a red light, I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The thought wouldn't leave me. If Jeff came back to warn me, then he must have believed there was still something left to change. That meant the future wasn't fixed, not completely. But if that was true, What part of Lucas's life had Jeff altered so deeply that he would cross time just to tell me he regretted it? The light turned green, but I didn't move right away. A car behind me honked gently, pulling me back to the present. I drove on. Eventually, I ended up near the area where small businesses sat side by side in aging brick buildings. Some had faded signs, others were shut entirely. It wasn't much, but it was the sort of place where careers started, or ended. Young professionals tried their luck here. Some succeeded, some didn't. I wondered if the older version of Lucas, the one Jeff knew, had ever walked these same streets. If he'd chased opportunities inside one of these buildings. If Jeff had taken something from him in a moment that shaped the rest of their lives. I parked and walked a little, letting the cold air bite at my skin. A bakery, a hardware store, a small financial office, a half-empty cafe. None of them meant anything to me now. But someday, they might have meant something to Lucas, or to Jeff, or to both. Maybe that's what unsettled me most. The realization that the future was already woven through the present, invisible threads tightening and loosening without my awareness. Inside the cafe, I ordered a coffee I didn't really want. The place was mostly empty, save for a man tapping on a laptop and a couple sharing a quiet conversation. I sat near the window and watched people pass by outside. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. A version of reality free from time travelers and warnings and regrets. For a moment, I envied them. I sipped the coffee and let my mind wander back to the moment Jeff approached me at the amusement park. I remembered the way he hesitated, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to speak to me at all. I remembered the guilt that shook his voice. And most of all, I remembered the urgency in his eyes, the way he seemed to carry a truth he hadn't meant to witness. It struck me then that Jeff never once mentioned his own success as something he was proud of, not even close. His success seemed like a burden, something he'd taken rather than earned, something he wished he could give back. If he had undercut Lucas, then maybe Lucas's loss had become Jeff's gain, and maybe that gain had cost him something far greater than a career, his conscience, his sense of self, his peace. A hollow feeling crept into my chest. What kind of future turned good men into versions of themselves they couldn't forgive? And what kind of future did Lucas face if someone like Jeff, someone haunted by remorse, stood in his way? The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as a customer entered. The sound pulled me from my thoughts, and I realized how long I'd been sitting there. I finished the coffee, more out of obligation than desire, and stood to leave. Outside, the air smelled faintly of winter. Clouds pressed low over the sky, the kind that made the day feel shorter than it was. I walked slowly toward my car, feeling as though every step brought me closer to something I wasn't ready to understand. Before getting in, I paused and looked down the street. For a fleeting moment, I imagined Jeff appearing at the far end of the sidewalk, coat pulled tight, head lowered, carrying the same look of exhausted sorrow. I imagined him walking toward me, ready to say something he hadn't said before. But the sidewalk was empty. No Jeff, no answers. Just the cold truth of a question he'd left behind. If regret could cross time, what else could? I sat behind the wheel and closed my eyes, letting the silence settle. And somewhere deep inside me, a new fear took shape. Quiet, steady, and unavoidable. What if Jeff wasn't the only person from the future carrying a burden into the past? I drove home slowly, letting the quiet hum of the engine fill the space where my thoughts kept circling. The sky had turned a muted orange by the time I reached our street, the kind of color that made everything look like an old photograph. When I parked, I didn't get out right away. I sat there watching the faint movement of curtains in nearby houses, the flicker of televisions glowing in living rooms, the silhouettes of neighbors preparing dinner. Normal life, unfolding peacefully. The kind of life Jeff's presence threatened to unravel inside me. When I eventually stepped through the front door, Lucas ran to me, waving a small paper airplane he'd made. "Dad, look how far it goes," he said, tossing it across the living room. The plane arced beautifully before landing near the couch. He beamed with pride, and for a moment I felt something warm crack through the cold weight I'd been carrying. "That's impressive," I said, ruffling his hair. "You're getting really good at this." His smile widened, and the sight of it, simple, unbroken, hit me harder than I expected. It reminded me that time wasn't just a line stretching forward into unknown dangers. It was also here, Right now, in moments like this, quiet and full of hope. Karen glanced up from the kitchen table. "You're home later than usual," she said softly. I nodded, hanging up my coat. "Long day. Sorry." She studied me for a second, as if trying to decide whether to ask more. But she let it go and returned to sorting through some mail. I was grateful for her patience, even if I didn't know how long it would last if the weight inside me kept growing. Later that evening, after Lucas settled into his room to read before bed, I stepped out to the backyard. The night air was colder than before, sharp enough to sting. The grass glistened faintly with frost, and the quiet felt deeper, like the world had paused just enough for thoughts to echo louder than usual. I leaned against the fence and stared at the sky. A few stars peeked through the thin clouds, steady and distant. I wondered what they looked like in Jeff's time. I wondered if Lucas ever looked at them as a grown man in that version of the future. Did he carry disappointment? Was he hardened by the betrayal Jeff described? Did he tell anyone about it? Did he forgive? Or did the bitterness stay with him? The questions multiplied, slipping through me like threads pulling tighter. The back door opened and Karen stepped outside in her sweater, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "You okay?" she asked. I hesitated. "Yes," I lied gently. "Just thinking." She stood next to me, her shoulder brushing mine. "You've been doing that a lot." I sighed, the breath curling in the cold air. "I know." We didn't speak again for a moment. The soft creak of the fence and the distant hum of traffic filled the silence. Finally, she said, "Whatever you're carrying, I hope you find a way to set it down." Her words struck deeper than she realized. Set it down. As if regret were something physical. As if the future Jeff described could be placed gently on the ground and left behind. But he hadn't left his behind. He had carried it back with him. Across years, maybe decades. Because something inside him refused to let him forget. After Karen went back inside, I stayed in the cold a while longer, trying to steady myself. I thought again about Jeff's expression, the hollow despair in his eyes. A man doesn't beg forgiveness from someone he barely knows unless desperation pushes him there, unless he sees something he can't escape. Eventually, I returned indoors. Lucas was half asleep in bed, clutching his stuffed bear, his airplane drawings scattered on the floor beside him. I stood in the doorway, watching the slow rise and fall of his breathing. He looked peaceful, untroubled, untouched by everything tearing at me. And that's when a new thought pressed in, quiet, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. If Jeff's visit had changed me this much in just a few days, what would it do to Lucas if he ever learned the truth? The weight of that question stayed with me long after I turned off the hallway light. The next morning arrived with a strange heaviness, as if the world had shifted slightly in its sleep and hadn't settled back into place. I woke early, before the alarm, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling while my thoughts drifted somewhere between yesterday and a future I couldn't imagine clearly anymore. The house was quiet, still wrapped in the soft gray of early dawn. I could hear Lucas breathing softly down the hallway, the steady rhythm of a child unaware of how fragile time could be. I sat at the edge of the bed for a long moment, rubbing my face with both hands. What was I supposed to do with everything Jeff had told me? How do you protect someone from something that hasn't happened yet, and maybe shouldn't happen at all? And how much of the future could change just because I now knew something I wasn't supposed to? The question stayed with me as I got ready. Karen stirred a little but didn't wake, her breath warm and steady. I envied that steadiness. She moved through life grounded, rooted, unshaken by the shadows that had grown around me since that day at the amusement park. Part of me wanted to tell her everything, to spill out the confusion, the fear, the strange hope, but another part held back, terrified of throwing this impossibility into her world. When I walked into the hallway, Lucas's door was slightly open, just enough for the golden edge of his nightlight to spill out across the floor. I peeked inside. He was still asleep, curled on his side with his arm around his stuffed bear. There was such innocence in that scene, such untroubled calm, that for a brief moment I allowed myself to believe the future Jeff described could be avoided simply by loving my son fiercely enough. But reality reminded me quickly that love alone doesn't rearrange time. At breakfast, Lucas talked about a science project his class was starting, a small experiment involving vinegar and baking soda. He explained every detail with excitement, waving his spoon around like a conductor of miniature symphonies. I smiled where I could, nodded when I should, but my mind didn't fully connect with the moment. Instead, I kept thinking about the older version of him, the one Jeff had known, the one who had worked hard enough to compete for something meaningful, the one who had been stepped over. Was he still a dreamer? Was he still this bright? Or had life dimmed something in him? After dropping Lucas off at school, I found myself turning down an unfamiliar road, letting instinct guide me again. I didn't want to go back to work. Not yet. My thoughts were too scattered, too unsettled. I needed space. The road led me to an industrial park I rarely visited. Large buildings stood in rows, quiet at this early hour, their metal siding dull in the morning light. There were no clear reasons for me to be there, no connection to Jeff's story, no link to Lucas's future. And yet, something about the place felt oddly significant. Maybe it was the sense of potential, the idea that businesses rose and fell here, opportunities collided, paths crossed. Maybe I was searching for glimpses of a future I'd never see. I parked near a small manufacturing building and stepped out. The air smelled faintly of oil and cold metal. A few employees walked toward the entrance, bundled in jackets, coffee cups in hand. Normal people starting normal days. None of them knew how someone's career could be quietly taken from them years later. None of them knew how regret could drag a man backwards across time. As I walked along the sidewalk, I tried to imagine the grown version of Lucas walking here someday. Briefcase in hand, a determined look on his face, unaware of what, or who, might stand in his way. The image felt too real, too close, and I had to steady myself. From a distance, a figure turned a corner of one of the buildings. My heart leapt into my throat, too fast, too suddenly, because for a split second I thought it was Jeff. The posture, the slow, deliberate way he moved, the way his head tilted down. But when he stepped fully into view, the illusion shattered. Younger man, taller, no resemblance at all. Still, the tremor stayed. I realized then that Jeff had changed something fundamental in me. I didn't see the world the same way anymore. Every stranger felt like a question. Every moment felt like a fork in the road. I returned to my car, gripping the cold handle, and sat inside with the engine off for a long time. Whatever future Jeff had lived, I had stepped into the edge of it, and there was no going back. I stayed in the car longer than I intended, watching people drift in and out of the nearby buildings. Nothing about their movements was unusual, just the rhythm of ordinary life. But something in me kept searching for patterns, as if the truth Jeff carried was hidden somewhere in these quiet, repetitive motions. I wasn't sure whether I was trying to understand the future or trying to outrun it. Eventually, I started the car and drove without thinking, letting intersections and stop signs decide my direction. My hands followed familiar turns, even when my mind didn't. I passed neighborhoods I'd known for years, small stretches of road I'd driven countless times, and yet it all felt strangely new, like I was seeing the world through a filter of uncertainty I couldn't remove. When I reached downtown, I found a parking spot near the library and stepped out. I didn't plan on going inside, but the building had always given me a sense of calm. It held a quiet kind of order, the kind that reminded me the world could still be understood, at least on paper. I walked up the steps slowly, as if each one weighed more than it should. Inside, the light was soft and warm, falling across shelves of books and long wooden tables. People sat scattered throughout, reading, studying, searching for answers of their own. I wandered through the aisles without purpose, running my fingers along the spines of books I had no intention of opening. Something about the quiet soothed me, even though nothing inside me felt settled. A thought surfaced then, one I hadn't let myself fully consider until that moment. Maybe the future Jeff described wasn't inevitable. Maybe knowing about it meant I could change something. But what? And how? I paused at a display of business books, guides on leadership, economics, entrepreneurship, books that shaped ambitions, books someone like Jeff or the older Lucas might have read. I stared at them for a long moment, thinking about opportunities, competition, the fragile nature of success, thinking about how easily one decision, one selfish choice, could ripple through someone's life. That was the part that shook me the most. Jeff hadn't acted out of malice. At least, that's not how he told it. He had acted out of ambition, impulsive, desperate, thoughtless ambition, the kind that people excuse in themselves until it's too late to undo. Maybe that's why he came back. Maybe he wanted me to see where ambition could lead. Or maybe he wanted me to steer Lucas away from becoming someone who could be stepped over. I wasn't sure which possibility frightened me more. When I left the library, the air was colder, sharper. The sky had shifted into the pale color of an early winter afternoon. I zipped my jacket and walked slowly back toward the car. On the way, I passed a small thrift shop I'd never paid much attention to. Something about the dusty windows and faded sign caught my eye. I stepped inside without really knowing why. The shop smelled like old paper and wood polish. Rows of forgotten objects lined the shelves. Typewriters, picture frames, tarnished clocks, boxes of mismatched toys. Objects that once belonged to other lives, other timelines. I found myself staring at an old desk clock with a cracked glass face. It wasn't running anymore. Its hands were frozen at some meaningless hour. But there was something symbolic about it. Time paused, time trapped. A reminder that even the things we rely on to measure the world can falter. A man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper. "Looking for anything in particular?" he asked. "No," I said quietly. "Just looking." He nodded and went back to reading. As I wandered through the aisles, a strange sense of calm settled over me. These objects, once important to someone, now sat silent and unmoving. Their stories had ended. Their futures had already played out. They were harmless now. Maybe the future Jeff came from could be like that someday. Just a thing that once existed, no longer threatening the present. On the drive home, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the streets. The town felt quieter than usual, as though holding its breath. When I pulled into the driveway, Lucas ran out to greet me with a drawing clutched in his hand. "Dad, look! I made a big rocket this time." His grin was so full of hope it almost hurt to look at. And for the first time in days, I felt something inside me shift. I couldn't control time. I couldn't predict the future. But maybe, just maybe, I could still choose how to walk toward it. That evening, after dinner and homework and the ordinary routines that carried us through the night, I found myself standing alone in the hallway outside Lucas's room. The door was slightly open, letting a sliver of warm light spill onto the carpet. I could hear him humming softly as he arranged his toys, building small worlds out of plastic bricks and imagination. The sound steadied me, yet deepened the ache inside me at the same time. I lingered there longer than I should have, listening. He was murmuring something about rocket boosters, testing how they'd survive landing on another planet. His innocence, his certainty that the world was something he could just build and rebuild, felt like a fragile miracle. Part of me wanted to freeze that moment forever, to keep him suspended in that unbroken time where no one could undercut him, where no one could steal a piece of his future. Eventually, I walked in. He looked up and grinned. "Dad," he said, "look at the landing gear. I added extra parts so it doesn't break." I knelt beside him. "That's smart," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You always think ahead." He nodded proudly, completely unaware of how those simple words hit me. Thinking ahead, planning, protecting. Those were things adults did. Things Jeff should have done before stepping over another person's life in whatever timeline he came from. "Dad?" Lucas asked suddenly. "Are you okay?" Children notice things adults hide. They always do. "I'm fine," I lied gently. "Just had a long day." He studied me for a moment, his eyes curious, thoughtful, then went back to his rockets. I sat with him for a while, pretending to help but really watching him, memorizing the small details, the curve of his smile, the way he bit his lip when he concentrated, the soft rise and fall of his shoulders. I didn't want to lose track of these things, not when I felt the future tugging at us from somewhere unseen. Later, after Lucas fell asleep, I stepped outside again for air. The backyard was quiet except for the faint rustle of branches and the distant whistle of a passing train. The cold night wrapped around me like a thin, uneasy blanket. I kept wondering why Jeff had chosen that moment to find me. Why he came when Lucas wasn't there, when he had just a small window of time before disappearing again. Had he been following us, searching for the right moment? Or was it coincidence, a fragile crossing of two timelines at the seam where guilt became unbearable? I couldn't shake the thought that Jeff had more he wanted to say, more he wished he could tell me but didn't. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he was running from something, or someone. Or maybe he'd already altered too much by speaking to me once, and coming back again risked breaking something deeper in the fabric of time. The longer I stood outside, the more one truth settled over me. Whatever Jeff wanted to change, he couldn't do it alone. He needed me to see something. He needed me to act. But act how? Do what? Prevent a future he never fully explained? The uncertainty pressed against my ribs until it became hard to breathe. When I finally went back inside, Karen was sitting on the couch with a blanket over her legs, reading. She looked up as I entered. "You're outside a lot these days," she said softly. I hesitated before answering. "I know, I'm just working through something." She nodded, closing the book slightly but not pressing further. That was one of the things I loved most about her. She didn't force open doors that weren't ready. Still, the concern in her eyes lingered like a small light flickering through a storm. "You'll figure it out," she said. "You always do." I wish that were true. I wished the future were something I could face with certainty instead of fear. After she went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the house dark except for a soft lamp in the corner. I stared at nothing, replaying that moment at the amusement park yet again. The way Jeff's expression folded in on itself when he looked at me, as if he were seeing the whole weight of the future reflected back. A thought rose quietly through the silence. Unexpected, unwelcome, yet unmistakably clear. If Jeff truly changed something by coming back, then my life had already begun to diverge from the one he knew. And maybe, just maybe, that meant his regret wasn't only a warning. Maybe it was a door he needed me to walk through, before it finally closed. I woke the next morning with a sense of quiet determination, something different from the confusion and fear that had followed me for days. It wasn't confidence, far from it, but a feeling closer to acceptance. Whatever Jeff had carried from the future, whatever regret had driven him to step across time just to stand in front of me for a few trembling minutes, it was now part of my life whether I wanted it or not, and pretending it wasn't there would only make the weight heavier. In the soft morning light, the house looked almost peaceful. Karen was already dressed for the day, moving quietly through the kitchen. Lucas sat at the table with a bowl of cereal, swinging his feet under the chair, humming the way he often did when he felt safe. For a moment I stood in the doorway watching them, feeling both lucky and painfully aware of how fragile our little world was. "Morning," Karen said, offering a small smile. "You look better today." The honesty in her voice caught me off guard. "Yeah," I said softly. "Trying to be." She nodded, as if she understood more than she should. "Good. It's nice to see you again." Lucas looked up, spoon in hand. "Dad, can we build another rocket after school?" His voice, bright and hopeful, centered me more than anything else could have. "Of course," I said. "We'll make it stronger this time." The moment settled gently around us. Warm, familiar, a reminder of what mattered most. But beneath it all was the quiet truth. The future wasn't just some far-off place anymore. It was something I could feel beginning to shift under my feet. After dropping Lucas off at school, I didn't turn back home. I drove instead to the edge of town, where the road opened into wide fields and bare trees. I pulled over near an empty lookout point, the kind people used to visit to watch sunsets in summer. This time of year, it was deserted. I got out and leaned against the railing, letting the cold wind brush across my face. The horizon stretched endlessly, the kind of open space that made you feel both small and strangely connected to everything. I needed the quiet. I needed the stillness. I needed to confront the simple fact I'd been avoiding. Jeff had come back for a reason, and whatever that reason was, I was part of it now. I thought again about his apology, how his voice cracked, how his hands trembled. I thought about the sorrow etched into every line of his face. That wasn't the expression of a man who simply felt bad about a mistake. That was the expression of someone who had lived with the consequences for years, someone who couldn't bear carrying them alone anymore. Did Lucas resent him in that future? Was their conflict something small that spiraled? Or was it something deeper, something that shaped who Lucas became as a man? The wind shifted, colder now, pushing across the empty fields. I closed my eyes and let the feeling wash over me. Maybe Jeff wasn't warning me about Lucas's future. Maybe he was warning me about how it happened, about the kind of choices that lead one person to step over another, about the kind of world my son might grow up in. Maybe he wanted me to help Lucas become someone who wouldn't be crushed by someone else's ambition, or tempted by it. But there was another thought too, one that rose slowly, stubbornly, from a deeper place. What if Jeff wasn't here to warn me at all? What if he was asking for help? Help fixing something that had already gone wrong? That thought lingered, settling into the cold morning like a quiet echo. Eventually, I got back in the car and drove home. On the way, I passed by the industrial district again. I slowed down, watching the people going in and out of the buildings, living their ordinary days. I wondered if Jeff had walked through places like these in his own time, if he had carried this regret for so long that it eventually forced him back into a past he barely remembered. When I reached home, Karen was in the living room folding laundry. She glanced up as I entered. "You okay?" she asked. I took a slow breath. I think I'm starting to understand a few things." She didn't ask what. She simply nodded and kept folding, giving me the space she somehow always knew I needed. I looked out the window toward the street, quiet, still, familiar, and for the first time since meeting Jeff, the fear that had been gripping me loosened just slightly. Whatever the future held, I wasn't walking into it blind anymore. I was walking toward it awake. I spent the afternoon half present, drifting through small tasks around the house, fixing a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, sorting mail, sweeping leaves that the wind kept pushing back across the porch. None of it really mattered, but the motions kept my hands busy while my mind followed its own path. Each thought returned to Jeff, his trembling apology, the way he swallowed his words as if afraid of saying too much, the grief behind his eyes. What kind of man carries a mistake through time? And what kind of mistake forces him to retrace the very moment he lost himself? Just after 3, I drove to pick up Lucas from school. The sidewalks were crowded with kids running ahead of their parents, backpacks bouncing, voices rising in soft waves. Lucas spotted me and his whole face lit up, a burst of uncomplicated joy that always struck something hopeful inside me. He climbed into the car still talking, already filling the space with stories from his day, who he sat with at lunch, what experiment they tried in class, and how his paper rocket almost hit the ceiling. I listened. I really listened. But beneath the warmth of his voice, a different thread tugged at me, a quiet, unignorable truth. Whatever future Jeff came from, Lucas was alive in it. Alive long enough to grow, to dream, to build something. Alive long enough for someone else's ambition to collide with his own. And that alone felt like a fragile blessing. On the drive home, Lucas fell into a thoughtful silence, staring out the window. After a moment, he asked, "Dad, when people grow up, how do they know what they're supposed to do?" The question stole the air from my chest. I cleared my throat softly. "I don't know if anyone ever really knows," I said. "But they try things, they learn, they listen to themselves, and they try to be kind along the way." He nodded slowly, as if storing the words somewhere important. "I want to build things," he said. "Stuff that helps people, stuff that lasts." Something inside me tightened in a way that felt both painful and protective. "You will," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "You really will." Back home, we built the rocket he wanted. Cardboard, tape, markers, nothing complicated. He asked me to help with the fins, and I watched him carefully line them up with concentration that looked older than his years. When we finished, he held the rocket up triumphantly, studying every detail as if evaluating his future through it. Later, while Lucas played in his room, I stepped outside again, needing the cold air to quiet the rush of thoughts. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the backyard. The world looked softer at that hour, more fragile, more temporary. Leaning against the fence, I let my gaze drift toward the street, half expecting, half fearing, that I might see Jeff standing there. The possibility hung in the air like a held breath, but the road remained empty, undisturbed. No mysterious figure, no apology waiting to be repeated. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that his absence meant something too. Jeff hadn't returned. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he wasn't supposed to. Or maybe he believed he'd already done enough, that his confession alone had shifted something inside me. The strange part was, he wasn't wrong, because ever since that moment at the amusement park, my understanding of time had become less linear, more fragile. The future no longer felt like a distant, abstract place. It felt close, so close it brushed against the present, whispering reminders of how easily it could bend. And something else had changed, too. I was no longer waiting for answers. I was preparing for possibilities. When I finally went back inside, Karen was setting the dinner table. She looked up, a softness in her expression I didn't deserve. "You seem a little lighter tonight," she said gently. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe I was. Not because the fear was gone, but because I had finally accepted it. "Yeah," I said. "Maybe I am." She smiled. "Good." As we ate together, just the three of us, in the warm glow of the dining room light, I realized something quietly profound. Whatever future Jeff came from, this moment right here mattered more. And I wasn't going to let someone else's regret decide what happened next. Not for me, and not for Lucas. That night, after Lucas fell asleep and the house settled into its usual quiet, I found myself wandering from room to room as if searching for something I couldn't name. The lights were dim, the silence soft, but my thoughts were anything but still. Every step seemed to stir another memory of Jeff, his trembling voice, the way he approached me like someone walking toward a difficult truth. I wondered if he had stood in his own home once, pacing the same way, trying to understand the weight of what he had done before it was too late. Eventually, I ended up in the living room, sinking into the couch with a quiet exhale. On the coffee table lay the notebook I'd written in days earlier, the one containing every detail I could remember about Jeff. I stared at it for a long moment, wondering whether to open it again or leave it untouched. Part of me feared that reading the words again would pull me deeper into a future I didn't want to confront. But another part knew that pretending ignorance wouldn't undo anything. It wouldn't protect Lucas. It wouldn't change whatever Jeff had lived through. After a long pause, I opened it. The pages felt heavier than paper should. Each line of writing, each attempt to capture another man's regret, seemed to echo back at me. I reread Jeff's confession. "I undercut your son to succeed." The words were shaky, uneven, handwriting betraying emotion I hadn't recognized at the time. Seeing it written by my own hand made it feel more real than hearing it had. As I traced the ink with my finger, a realization settled in quietly. Maybe Jeff hadn't wanted forgiveness from me. Maybe he had wanted a witness. Someone who could understand the cost of ambition before it took root in a child who still dreamed of building rockets out of cardboard. I closed the notebook slowly, letting the idea settle. The room felt smaller when I looked up, shadows stretching along the walls like they too were waiting for something. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, but eventually I heard soft footsteps behind me. Karen stepped into the room, her expression warm but cautious. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not yet." She sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. For a moment she didn't say anything. She just breathed quietly with me, matching her pace to mine. "You know," she said softly, "I don't need to know everything to see you're struggling, and I don't need the details to care." Her words hit deeper than she knew. "I'm trying," I whispered. "I know." She placed her hand on mine, steady, grounding, and I felt a pressure ease in my chest, just slightly. For the first time in days, I didn't feel entirely alone inside my confusion. After she went back to bed, I remained in the dim light for a long while, listening to the quiet hum of the house. Eventually, I stood and walked to the window. The street outside lay still, washed in pale orange from a distant street lamp. It was the kind of silence that felt old, almost timeless. A silence that reminded me the world was so much larger than my fears, but also so much more fragile. As I looked out across the empty street, a thought surfaced, gentle at first, then sharp. If Jeff could cross time because of regret, could I shape my present because of hope? Maybe the future wasn't a straight line. Maybe it wasn't a prison of events already decided. Maybe it was a collection of choices so small they felt invisible until years passed, and a man looked back wishing he could change just one. I gazed toward Lucas's room at the end of the hallway, the soft glow of his nightlight barely visible from where I stood. The future felt closer in that moment, not as a threat, but as a responsibility. I couldn't control what Jeff had done. I couldn't rewrite the version of Lucas he'd known, but I could shape the path that led away from it. I could teach my son how to build, not just rockets or ideas, but a life that didn't rise on someone else's fall. A life grounded in kindness, resilience, and choices he could stand by. The thought settled inside me like a small, steady flame. Whatever Jeff had come to tell me, whatever future he carried with him, I finally understood something important. The present was still mine, and so was Lucas's. And maybe, in ways I didn't fully grasp yet, Jeff had given me a chance he never gave himself. I still think about Jeff sometimes, usually in the quiet hours of the night, when the world folds into itself and the choices we've made feel sharper than usual. I replay the moment he approached me at that amusement park, the way he said my son's name, the way his voice trembled under the weight of a future I couldn't see. He looked like someone who had carried regret long enough to know it never really leaves you. It only settles in deeper places. I never saw him again. Not at the park, not in town, not in any shadowed corner where fate might have crossed our paths once more. But his absence became its own presence, subtle, steady, shaping the way I moved through my days. I started watching Lucas more carefully, but not with fear, with intention, with the quiet understanding that the world ahead of him would be shaped by choices I couldn't predict, but also by the ones I made here, now. Sometimes I wonder what Jeff expected from me. Maybe he didn't know either. Maybe he came because he couldn't bear the loneliness of carrying a future he'd broken alone. Or maybe he hoped a single conversation, a small shift, could ripple outward in ways he would never live to witness. Lucas grows a little each day. He laughs, he builds, he dreams. I see pieces of the man he might become, flickering like lanterns in the distance. And though I can't see the road he'll walk, I know one thing with certainty. I will walk carefully beside him, for as long as time allows. Whatever Jeff saw, whatever he regretted, that future isn't written here, not yet. And every choice we make, every kindness, every pause, every step, might be enough to lead us somewhere better than the world he came from, somewhere my son can still belong.